Have you ever heard of the wave of UFO sightings in the 1970s that was in the Dneal Triangle? If you have heard this case before from somebody else, I promise you, I'm about to tell it in a way that has never been told. While you're watching, please remember to try and find that hidden clue, and if you find it, put what it is with the timestamp in the comments to be entered into the giveaway. Okay, so without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. It was shaping up to be a perfectly ordinary spring day in the quaint seaside village of Broadhaven. Students at the local primary school poured into the courtyard for recess, and their laughter and shouts were filling the air. But young Dave Davies ended up joining a group of classmates kicking a football around, though his mind was often just wandering into the abyss. Gazing out past the schoolyard, Dave saw in the middle of the field behind him was full of sheep that were just meandering about, and he remembered his father grumbling that morning about needing to repair a hole in the fence separating their tiny farm from that field. And though he was only 10 years old, Dave was anxious to help his dad with the tasks of running their struggling operation. But then the shrill of a whistle snapped Dave back from his thoughts, and glancing around, he realized the playground had fallen strangely silent. The children were just all frozen in place, with their mouths open in awe, and they were looking at the field in front of them. And as Dave kind of followed the direction of their stare, he felt his blood literally turn to ice, because hovering about 30 feet in the air above the tree line was some sort of aircraft, the likes of which Dave had never seen. The silver, cigar-shaped craft was rounded at the front with a domed compartment perched on top. Plus, these strange symbols were etched along its smooth metallic hull. And Dave's skin prickled with these goosebumps as this enormous object drifted slowly across the horizon. And a few of the children screamed. Others muttered, what is this thing? As older kids tried to calm them down, Dave just watched, mouth open in awe. He always considered himself somewhat as a skeptic, someone who needed proof before believing such crazy claims. Yet here, right in front of his eyes, was something straight out of a sci-fi movie, and it looked awfully real. This is when the teachers then herded all the students back inside, insisting that they were just letting their imaginations run wild. But Dave knew exactly what he saw. None of the teachers believed the children, so the headmaster separated them and got them to draw what they saw. And even though there were slight, tiny variations, most of what they draw was basically the exact same thing. So what would that be if they didn't actually see it? A shared imagination? And all these kids weren't on like ayahuasca or anything, so how do you explain that? But later that day, as soon as the final bell rang for school, he raced from the building and sprinted towards the field just to take a closer look. So crouching in the grass near this scorched now circle of earth, Dave noticed something shimmering in the center of the burnt patch. It appeared to be this weird shard of metal, unlike anything that he ever knew to exist. Pocketing his interstellar souvenir, he gazed around anxiously before heading back home. Then over dinner that evening, Dave reluctantly described the odd craft to his parents. And his father, chuckled while his mother shot him a worried glance. "You kids gotta stop reading so many crazy comics," his father said. "Now eat up before your food gets cold." And Dave said okay in his head, and he just kept quiet after that, turning the glittery shard over in his pocket. Why did none of the adults believe him? And in the weeks that followed, Dave noticed this unease growing in his village. Normally a lively, welcoming place, his hometown had taken on a subdued and suspicious air. I mean, this school sighting was just the first in this rash of bizarre sightings. I mean, there were hushed rumors of missing livestock and eerie glows in the night sky. Not to mention, 2 months later, Rosa Granville, who ran the Haven Fort Hotel in nearby Little Haven, described seeing an object which looked like an upside-down saucer and 2 faceless humanoid creatures with pointed heads. Now, I've heard of this pointed heads thing before with UFOs and extraterrestrials, and I just want to say from my personal experience of what I have read, I believe it's actually some sort of helmet or crown that they are wearing, but maybe they really did have pointed heads. Plus, she said that so much heat was coming off this thing that her face felt burnt. Their chilling appearance and the scorched earth left in the wake sparked whispered tales of alien visitors with sinister intentions. And Dave was just watching this whole time the whole thing played out. And he could see the growing tension with curiosity and concern. He listened intimately to his classmates as they eagerly swapped stories, while skeptical parents and teachers, just brushed it off as these childish tales. And he kept his little glittering shard tucked away in his sock drawer, pulling it out at night to examine it by flashlight the nights that he couldn't fall asleep. Try as he might to make sense of the strange happenings going on in his town, Dave felt certain things would only continue spiraling. And as feared over subsequent months, apprehension gave way to hysteria as more residents reported unsettling sightings. And Dave noted the burgeoning crowds of journalists and UFO enthusiasts flocking to the once secluded seaside community, and his parents at the time just shook their heads at the excited chatter, refusing to buy into the utter nonsense. But Dave felt that too many ordinary townsfolk with nothing to gain were sharing chillingly aligning accounts. I mean, why would they fabricate such elaborate tales if not to make sense of things they truly witnessed together? And their frightened testimonies painted a picture of otherworldly visitors creeping through the night, unleashing these strange lights, sounds, and symbols meant to disorient and instill fear. And he had an unshakable feeling extraterrestrial beings were afoot, though to what end he could not even begin to imagine. And by summertime, Broadhaven had erupted into full chaos. Outsiders swarmed the streets, turning the village into a sideshow spectacle, and further unsettling its rattled residents. Plus, these wild theories now ran rampant, like that the beings were scouts plotting an invasion, or the military testing these experimental technology on unsuspecting citizens, or an elaborate prank by students from a local college. But Dave struggled to reconcile the terror he saw etched across the faces of his family, friends, and neighbors with any casual explanation. I mean, why would scores of solid, sensible people along this unassuming stretch of Welsh coast invent such elaborate lies? And who or what was meticulously orchestrating this elaborate ruse? Now, Dave felt certain what lurked beneath that morning furor lay unsettling truths he desperately needed to uncover. And then as one chaotic summer faded into the next, the commotion eventually died down and a tenuous calm settled back over the town. Most outsiders drifted away in search of the next viral sensation, and there were a few sporadic sightings that still emerged here or there, which Dave dutifully logged and analyzed. But for a while it seemed the inexplicable siege had finally ceased. And yet decades later, long after Dave had now grown up and now moved across the country with his own family, Broadhaven held its breath in uneasy anticipation. because its unlucky residents knew that whatever sinister force had darkened their doorsteps might someday return. Once their guard was down and the hubbub had fully died away. And when that day came, Dave didn't know if answers or just deeper terror would emerge. But having witnessed unimaginable things drift across that field decades ago as a young boy, he knew that for Broadhaven, life would never be the same. And at the end of the day, this was one of those stories where if you thought it was just children and their crazy imaginations, you would be wrong. Because in this particular story, you can take all the children out of the story, and yet you still have the story. Some of you might have heard of the Broadhaven UFO sightings before, but I just wanted to tell it to you in a different way, and I hope you really enjoyed it. Also, I got a lot of interesting things that will be coming out soon, so I hope you stick around with us, and if you haven't already, please like this video, and that's all I have for you guys today. Cheers.
Well, I saw the spaceship. I didn't see the man. The spaceship, it looked a cigar shape with a dome on it, and it had a yellowy orange to red light on the top of it.
How clearly did you see it?
Well, I couldn't see its face because it was too far away.
Oh, you say you saw a man as well, did you?
Yes.
And what about him?
Well, he was too far away to be seen as well.
My friend Philip here was trying to find a way over the stream, and I was looking at the bushes up the top of the trees. And then suddenly this silver cigar-shaped object seemed to pop up from behind the bushes and trying to take off. Then it disappeared again.
Now guys, I do have a video coming out soon about sleep paralysis, and I've even in fact had it many times, so I might be in the story. But I'm only preluding that because it might have something to do with today's video, or it might not. You be the judge. Now, Mark H. says he was abducted by aliens, and he clearly remembers awakening one night, unable to move anything at all but his eyes. And that's when he saw flashing lights and heard this buzzing sound, and he experienced feelings of levitation and felt like electric tingling sensations. Now, most terrifying were the non-human figures that he saw by his bed. Now, Mark, of course, believes these were aliens, and later he underwent hypnosis to try to recall exactly what had happened to him. And under hypnosis, Mark remembered being whisked through an open window to a large spaceship. Now, he was very frightened when these aliens took him into some kind of medical examining room, and there they say that one of them had intercourse with him. And from the story that I've read, it doesn't say if it was mutual or not. He just mentions that they did have intercourse. Now, afterwards, the aliens brought him back to Earth and returned him to his bed. Now, Mark describes the experience as terrifying, but did it really happen? You see, there are some researchers at a little place called Harvard University, and they devised this experiment to determine if memories of an abduction by space aliens would provoke the same physiological reactions that occur when other people, such as combat veterans and those who survived deadly car accidents, recall their traumatic experiences. So Richard McNally, who was a professor of psychology, and his colleagues recruited 6 women and 4 men who claimed they had been spirited away by extraterrestrials, and some of them actually more than once. So under hypnosis at this point, 7 out of the 10 of them reported having had their sperm or eggs extracted for breeding purposes, or experiencing direct intercourse with the space aliens themselves. Now, each one of these people was either interviewed by McNally or Susan Clancy, who was also a professor of psychology. Now, each also wrote a script that they told the story of his or her abduction, and the research team then made audio tapes, spoken in a neutral voice and from the scripts. And that's when the abductees listened to these tapes in the laboratory of Scott Orr at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. And as the tapes just kept playing and playing, the researchers recorded their emotional responses using such measures as heart rate and sweat and even the sweat on the palm of their hands. And that same procedure was done with 8 people haunted by traumatic experiences that were unrelated to alien abductions as well. And when the 2 sets of measurements were compared in the end, the results were striking. Now, the abductees showed surprisingly strong physiological reactions to the tapes of their alien encounters. Their reactions were as great or greater than those of individuals who cannot shake memories of combat, sexual abuse, and other punishing events. Now, of course, they try to explain this away by saying it could be sleep paralysis mixed with, some hallucinations. I'm not going to say that's not possible. Now, believe whatever you want, but I'll leave you with this. When it comes to sleep paralysis, we have an upcoming story next week that will bring chills down all your spines. So, do you think that the mere science of them reacting the same or stronger to, other victims of horrible things makes their stories true? Let me know in the comments. On the 6th of June, 1980, Zygmunt Adamski disappeared from the village of Todmorden in the rural county of Yorkshire after leaving his house to run an errand. 5 days later, his body was located on top of a coal pile in a coal supplier's yard. The police went to the scene and did an examination, and they discovered burn marks vividly on this man's shoulders and neck, along with a green ointment covering all of his wounds. So the man's clothes were exceptionally clean, despite the fact that he was missing for 5 days. So the police and everybody else had one question. It was, how did this happen? And also, how did he end up on top of a pile of coal? Now, a very strange aspect of this man's discovery was that there appeared to be no footsteps leading up to the coal pile or into the coal itself. Yet he was laying on top of it, so how did he climb up the coal pile without leaving any footmarks in the coal? So after this, police, they spoke to the owners of the coal yard, and the last person to be in the yard was the coal company's son. And he told the police that he'd been there in the morning until about midday, and that he saw nobody on a pile of coal, at least at that point. After this, Mr. Adamski's body was transported to the local hospital, where a pathologist determined that his death had occurred between 11 and 1 p.m. that day. But the strange burns on his body and neck occurred 2 days before his death. The coroner, James Turnbull, said what led to his death could not be answered, but determined that he did die of a heart attack due to shock and fright, and his face at the time of his death had been contorted in fear. So for the pathologist and the police, the circumstances of the man's death were a complete mystery. Plus, they had no idea where he had been for several days since he left his house and what that strange ointment on his wounds were. It could just not be explained. This case was never solved any further after that. So how did he get on top of that coal pile? More importantly, what caused his face to be contorted in fear when he died? But there is an addition to this unexplained story. There was a policeman, Mr. Alan Godfrey, and he had been the first to arrive at the scene in the coal yard. And a few weeks after this, Mr. Godfrey was on a night shift when something very strange happened. So he was out searching for cows that went missing from a farmer's field, and he could find absolutely no sign of them. So he was sitting back in his patrol car when suddenly a large object appeared on the road right ahead of him. It was very big, and he first thought that it might be a bus that broke down, but the lights on the object looked strange to him, and at that point he kind of realized this isn't a bus. So he decided to radio for backup before leaving his vehicle to investigate. But he found that his police radio would not work. And at this time he started to feel very uneasy, so he remained in his car. And later he was shocked to discover that nearly an hour of time had passed by that he could not account for. And even stranger, the sides of his boots now looked like they had been dragged along the ground, and the soles of his shoes were ripped apart. It would later be established on the same night that other policemen on duty independently called police headquarters with alarming reports of seeing strange bright lights in the sky. And they were looking up and they saw these strange lights in the sky descending into the valley. And even a member of the public who was out driving that night also called police with the same description, and they were very concerned, to say the least. So as for the missing cows, they were actually later discovered in a field which they did not belong, but this field was locked with a padlock gate, and the ground in the field was very muddy, but oddly enough there were no hoof prints from the cows. So how could the cows have entered the field without leaving any prints from their hooves, and how did they enter a locked field? It was almost as though, perhaps like Mr. Adamski too, they had been dropped there from above. So the policeman, Mr. Godfrey, he was so disturbed by all of this that he visited a hypnotherapist who specialized in regression therapy, which is taking a patient back into a past event. Now, Godfrey was particularly uneasy about the missing time that he still couldn't account for. And under hypnosis, he began to explain that he seemed to find himself in a small room with a black-robed, bearded man who had a biblical appearance. Also, this man was accompanied by a huge black dog and other smaller creatures that were the size of 5-year-olds and had like robotic movements. Very strange stuff. Now, if you look at all this evidence, it seems that a person with rationale in their head might seem to say that they were dropped, and that is the only way there could be no footprints up to the coal or no hoof prints in the mud. But also it was this next thing that really solidified for me that this actually could be aliens or something that's, as of this point, to us, unexplained. And it was that the ointment found on Mr. Adamski's body was never able to be scientifically identified. Why he disappeared, only to turn up dead in the most bizarre way, remains to be an enigma that to this day is still unknown. Maybe one day we will find out what happened to Mr. Adamski and why he died. Maybe one day we will find out how those cows got into a different field that was padlocked. And maybe one day we will find out what happened during that missing hour of Mr. Godfrey's time. Either that, or we'll never know at all. On May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson set out to celebrate the end of that year's classes with his friends, and he attended a couple of local gatherings that evening, first in Lind, which is near his home in Marshall, then in Canby, which is roughly about 30 miles away from his house. Now, Swanson's friends would later report that while they saw Swanson drinking, he didn't seem drunk. Okay, so you guys really gotta listen to this one. Swanson left Canby sometime after midnight to drive home, a trip he made practically every day as part of his commute to and from school. But that night, instead of taking Minnesota State Highway 68, which is the most direct route between Canby and Marshall, Swanson chose to drive through rural farming roads. Now, perhaps this was to sightsee in the middle of the night, or perhaps it was to avoid police because he drank a little bit. But whatever his reason may be, he soon got into trouble. Swanson veered into a ditch near a farming field, and because His car's wheels were now elevated. He couldn't get any traction at all to drive away or back out. And around 1:54 a.m., Swanson called his parents asking for a ride home. And he told them he was near Lind, about 10 minutes away from their home in Marshall. So Swanson's parents said yes, and they headed out to pick him up. Now, staying connected to the call as they drove, they found nothing but pitch darkness. So tempers kind of flared in the early hours as these frustrations grew. "Wait a minute, don't you see me?" Swanson asked as both he and his parents flashed their car headlights to signify their presence. And at one point, Swanson just hung up. And then his mother called him back, apologizing, and Swanson told his parents he would just walk back toward his friend's house in Lind. And so Swanson's father dropped his wife off back at home and continued towards Lind, remaining on the phone with his son. I mean, isn't this already getting weird enough? He says he's one place 10 minutes down the road. He waits till they get there, on the phone with them. They're flickering their lights saying, "Hey, we're here." And he's not there. But then, continuing, as he walked in the darkness, Swanson suggested that his parents meet him in the parking lot of a popular nightclub in Lind, and decided to cut across a field as a shortcut. Now, continuing on, he claimed to his dad to see these lights of something nearby, and then abruptly shouted out, "Oh shit," to his dad while still on the phone, and then the call ended. Now, to this day, no one knows what happened to him. No body found. None of his belongings found. Nothing. But who knows? Perhaps, a farmer shot him because he was on their land and they shot first and asked questions later. Or perhaps it was so dark that he accidentally stepped in a river and accidentally drowned. Or there's the theory that might make the most sense, to me at least, and that was that he was abducted, and possibly by aliens. Now, I know that may be far-fetched, but it could happen. It would explain the lights right before he lost connection, and then his body was never seen again. So I don't know. But you tell me what you think right now in the comments. So I need to know this. Did you like this format of shorter stories in the same episode? Or would you rather see these in separate episodes? It's all up to you. So please just let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. And please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time.